Hi, Professor. My name is Lucy Maldonado, and today I'll be discussing the communication elements for the movie Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, which was released in 2016. First, let's review the plot of the film. So, Jumanji is set in Brantford, New Hampshire, where a teenage boy, Alex, received a board game which converted to a video game cartridge. When Alex began to play the game, he was transported into the actual video game. He's been missing for 20 years. So 20 years later, in the same town, a group of 4 high school students were in detention. They find the video game and they begin to play it. So the 4 main characters in this movie are Spencer. He's considered shy and quirky. Anthony, he's a popular football player. Bethany is popular and a bit self-centered. Martha, she's intelligent and reserved. Each of them selected their game avatars. Suddenly, the 4 players are transported into the same video game as Alex was 20 years ago. So, there was one avatar that wasn't able to be selected, and that was the pilot. So, their avatars are complete opposites from their actual personalities. So throughout the game, each player receives directions through a non-player character that in order to complete the game, they must find and restore a missing gem to the heart of Jumanji. Their game lives are dwindling as they experience an array of obstacles. Another avatar, the pilot, helps them avoid certain death, only to find the avatar is actually the teenage boy Alex who went missing just 20 years ago. So all avatars join forces to complete the video game and are released back into the real world. Alex is reunited with his parents, and the other 4 main characters have a new appreciation on life and honestly one another. So the 4 main characters in this film are Spencer, Anthony, Martha, and Bethany. So on the top picture here, you're going to see the real world characters. So you have Spencer, you have Anthony, you have Martha, and Bethany. So Spencer considers himself a nerd, as we mentioned. Well, in Jumanji, he's an archaeologist, and his name is Dr. Smolder Bravestone, and he actually has no weaknesses and is extremely fit. Then you have Anthony, that's playing a zoologist, Franklin Finbar, and he's extremely short. His weaknesses consist of cake, speed, and strength. And you have Martha. Martha's Ruby Roadhouse. She's a killer of men, and weakness is venom. Now you have Bethany here. She becomes Professor Shelley, who is actually an overweight male who specializes in the reading of maps. Many weaknesses, one of which is endurance. So in this presentation, we're going to review some communication elements. There's going to be 6 here. So the first is culture, next is listening, verbal messages, nonverbal messages, interpersonal relationships, and finally conflict management. So the culture of the main characters are middle class. They're teenage high school students. They're heavily influenced by their cell phones and, of course, social media. Spencer is a young Caucasian male that is academically stable. He lacks some self-esteem and is not at all confident in his communication with the opposite sex. Well, with Martha, she's a Caucasian female. She's shy, she's intelligent, and unable to express herself with boys. Anthony is an African-American football player who's popular and confident. Bethany is a confident cheerleader who is self-absorbed in the culture of social media and how others perceive her about her appearance. So the culture of the 4 main characters. So during the beginning of the movie, the 4 main characters are high school students that are sent to detention and requested to pull staples from old papers in the basement. The dominant cultures are quickly identified in real life because the teenage high school students are segregated into popular and unpopular labels. The popular teenage kids are dominant and the unpopular kids adapt to the popular kids' traditions and behaviors in order to fit in. So the cultural characteristics and communication during the beginning of the film was mostly verbal communication based on beliefs, social organizations, and attitudes, including responses to parents, teachers, friends, and of course, classmates. The ways the main characters improved their intercultural communication was when they were sucked into the video game of Jumanji. Their characters quickly put their differences aside and leaned on one another's strengths. Their characters realized the cultural differences that once separated them would need to unite them towards the same goal of surviving the video game. So listening. Listening was a common internal barrier that honestly all four main characters had. One of the common, of course, was an external barrier of distractions. Now, in this scene that I'm going to explain, this was specifically with Bethany and her teacher. So there was a scene when Bethany was on her cell phone with a friend in the beginning of the movie. While the class was taking an exam, Bethany was completely distracted. So Bethany's teacher walked up and she asked her to end the call. Bethany was, of course, distracted about her own interpretation of her boyfriend, not commenting on her Instagram post that she was completely distracted and unaware of her surroundings, as I mentioned. Bethany perceived herself as justified for the phone call because of her internal emotional state, which distracted her from effectively listening to her teacher's request. In the beginning of the movie, each player selected their avatars and were immersed into the video game of Jumanji. Because of the appearance of each character was completely different than their real world, there were a lot of screeches. There were a lot of phrases criticizing their avatars, comparing their real life appearance to what was conveyed through connotations and polarizations. So polarization is the act of going from either good or bad. In the real world, Anthony, also called Fridge or nicknamed Fridge by Spencer, is a tall football player who now is a short black man. The use of how Fridge describes his avatar is a form of negative connotation. He screams when speaking informally to grab the attention of Spencer and to communicate his frustration of being stuck in such a tiny body. Throughout the scene, although their characters each have a name, they call one another by their actual real world names, and this form of informal language helped the audience identify the real life characters and connect the two. So nonverbal messages. The two that I'm going to speak to you about are symbolic and process. So first, the symbolic. That would be the tattoos that were present on the wrist of each character once they were submerged into Jumanji. Each main character noticed that they each had 3 lines on their wrists. And when one character died, they realized that line would fade away. So that signified the lives that they had remaining in the game, in the video game. So they were fearful of losing all of those lines, which represented life. So process. Spencer had feelings for Marcia in the beginning of the movie. However, he could not communicate those feelings to her in the real world. So after saving one another's lives and the constant interaction, their relationship quickly developed while in Jumanji. By the end of the movie, they cared so much for one another, they became a couple. And what I found funny about the film is both of them had a quirky type personalities. And as you can see on the picture to the left, Spencer is trying to kiss Martha and unfortunately fails. He looks more like he's kissing her nose. So just a lot of nonverbal messages that the two had with one another that developed their relationship. So the interpersonal relationships, both Spencer and Anthony were once childhood friends. Their relationship became estranged as each of them began to fit into the different cultures within the high school setting. So Spencer was unpopular, and Anthony was considered one of the popular kids, so they ended up drifting apart in the real world. So Spencer was shy, he's fearful of rejection and change. Anthony's confident and eager to impress others with his outgoing personality. While stuck inside the video game of Jumanji, a shared meaning was introduced to Spencer when the characters were gearing up to complete the video game to return once again into the real world. So a shared meaning represents the sender of the message is connecting with the receiver to ensure that they can relate to the true meaning. So Spencer feared losing his last life. Anthony was a football player and a strange childhood best friend reminded Spencer that in real life we always just have the one life to live. So Anthony used his real life experience in form of a shared meaning to develop a football game strategy, so a football play, and ultimately devised a plan to complete the final level using his team, which consisted the four main characters. So conflict management. In the video game, Spencer is depicted as the alpha male. His avatar has no fears. Strength is considered, endurance, a smoldering gaze, powerful physique, and experience, of course, in combat. So because of Spencer and Fridge's prior relationship and tension between the two, Fridge would consistently try to humiliate Spencer's lack of courage in the real life. This is a form of deterioration of their once lifelong friendship. So Fridge saw both Spencer and Martha bonding and lashed out to Spencer, reminding him his primary focus should be on getting out of the game so they all could get back to their regular lives. This is an illustration of closeness and the internal dialect. Fridge was focused on getting out of the game and did not want Spencer to share his happiness with him because Fridge felt Spencer's feelings were insignificant. So as an expression of his frustration, Fridge pushed Spencer off of a mountain on purpose, which ended up resulting in a lost life for Spencer. This was a deterioration of their previous relationship as friends. So once Spencer's avatar returned, Spencer stood up to Fridge and defended his relationship with Martha and warned him never to touch him like that again. After this conflict, the two regained a mutual respect and understanding for one another and realigned their relationship. So to sum this up, my personal review on this movie and the communication elements, during the beginning of the film, the characters barely tolerated one another. The only similar issue that they had was serving a detention at their high school. When they were thrust into that video game, their lives just completely changed. They began to quickly unite, and they had more of a serious goal in front of them, and that goal was to stay alive in the video game so that they can then return to real life. So the main characters began their communication based on their cultures and previous experiences. As these characters began to get to know each other while in the video game, their interpersonal relationships started changing. The main characters focused on the same goal of finishing the video game and going back to their real lives. Their communication styles began to adapt to look at the rewards and costs associated with finishing the video game. The characters used interdependent relationships because they relied on one another's strengths and had to protect one another's weaknesses to reach the ultimate goal of reaching the end of the game. Ultimately, the connection the characters made in surviving this ordeal developed a symmetrical relationship where the characters saw themselves as equals, no longer that culture of popular and unpopular. They all adapted, and it was an amazing ending to a beautiful story. That unpopular and popular, it's all the same thing as long as you respect one another.